Jeff Ratcliffe is the president at FTN Fantasy and an on-air talent at both SiriusXM Radio and CBS Sports. Before all that, he spent about a decade at Pro Football Focus. He's got a PhD in anthropology, and I guess he kind of has one in fantasy football too. These are his late-round perspectives. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't played over at Underdog yet, now's the perfect time. There are tons of different best ball leagues that you can join, and there's definitely a league out there that fits what you're looking for. And you can use all the things that I've talked about with guests on Becoming a Best Ball Bro to crush those drafts. But like I said, now's the right time to join up. Because if you go and you sign up and use promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a nice deposit offer, but you also get a free late round draft guide. That's a $25 guide emailed to your inbox after signing up for absolutely free. So head to UnderdogFantasy.com, sign up using promo code LATEROUND, and make a deposit. I can confirm it's a really, really fun platform to play on. Now back to the show. Yeah, man, I'm super pumped to have you on. I don't know if people realize that like you and I go so far back within the space. This is back in like, I don't even know if people realize that I wrote for PFF for like, I don't know, how long was it? 3 months? Something along those lines?
Yeah, it was something like that. Yeah, 3 months. We were like, oh, this JJ knows what he's doing. Let's offer him some money because we actually had a budget, and you turned us down.
and then I immediately pieced out, and I got a gig at Number Fire, and then the rest, as they say, is history. But you spent like almost a decade, right, at PFF?
It was like, 2 months short of a decade. Yep.
That's wild. That is wild. So yeah, like you and I have known each other for a while. We got to hook back up a little bit at the Fantasy Football Expo as we do each year. So it was great to see you. Like I said, you've been in the space for a while now. You and I crossed paths so many times. We've done plenty of shows and such together. But, just for anyone listening that maybe hasn't listened to your stuff, or at least recently, or doesn't know your journey or who you are as an analyst, how would you describe your approach as an analyst? Like, who are you as an analyst, Jeff Ratcliffe?
Wow. That is, that could go in so many different directions, but I think to start, I should say that fantasy is just my excuse to talk about football.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing. Like JJ, part of our generation here, as Rich Rebar calls us, the CD generation, we were in between VHS and then like MP3 streaming and all that. But our generation, we didn't just go out and say, hey, start this player because I work for 3 or 4 letter network. It was, here's what I'm doing. Here's, my knowledge of the game. Here's how I'm applying it to fantasy football, and then taking it from there. And I think a lot of that for me comes from my background. I was a grad student in the aughts. I was a college professor throughout the course of getting a PhD. And I played a lot of poker as well. I pretty much did anything I could to procrastinate, and I would talk about hands and walk through the process there. And eventually, like poker, obviously the moneymaker boom was over, the whole full tilt thing happened, and I stopped doing that, and I started just lurking in message board forums in fantasy football in like 08, 09, started writing a little bit, and then in 2010 it came around that everything is timing. And I reached out to a particular person. He said he had an opportunity, but he had to wait about a month. The opportunity ended up being PFF, and the person was Mike Clay. And, it just couldn't have worked out better. But then even from there, I really had to, work my tail off to get into this thing. And I realized along the way, there were some parallels to what I did as a professor. I was teaching a subject that most people did not give a crap about. They were there for 3 credits, a B+, maybe an A-, and then moving on. And the subject is cultural anthropology. I had to find ways to make it interesting, make it engaging, and make it relatable. And I really tried to do that with football concepts, and maybe even some of the advanced fantasy concepts, so that anybody can understand these things, anybody can use them, anybody can apply them. And then ultimately, hopefully, they can enjoy football more in the process. There was a great realization that happened to me many years ago. On a Sunday, like a lot of people, was sitting there watching games, had the laptop open with the scores, and I was utterly miserable because whatever was happening with my fantasy teams. And it was like, at the end of the day, I realized, holy crap, I just hated watching football. Like that should not be the case.
Yeah.
So I don't even pay attention to box scores anymore or anything like that throughout the course of the day. I just want to sit there and enjoy the game because we're lucky enough to get to see these players doing superhuman things on the football field.
That's a really healthy outlook. I wish I could get to that place where I'm not tilting like over every single play. And then at the end of the day, it always ends up just kind of being a moot point to begin with. Like you're frustrated, you're annoyed at like 1:30, and then it ends up being fine. It's never that big of a deal. That's a really healthy approach and way of thinking of things. How did you like get so into football in the first place? Was it just you being embedded where you grew up? Obviously, in the Northeast especially, it's going to be a place where football is just sort of a part of that city, the city that you grew up in, city I grew up in, same deal. Was it that, or were you a player? What was it?
No, I wasn't a player. And also, don't believe Google out there, people. I was not a former professional lacrosse player. That is another person named Jeff Ratcliffe. This dude actually doesn't live far from me in Pennsylvania, and he knows that I exist. I know that he exists, obviously, but Google does not realize we're two people. So it's his Wikipedia and then my pictures everywhere from doing stuff like this. But anyway, no, I ran track and field in the high school level and the college level. I actually didn't play football outside of peewee football. But the reason why I got so into this aspect, believe it or not, JJ, and it's so weird because I don't really pay attention to this sport anymore, but it's baseball. Yeah. I grew up with baseball cards, and my favorite thing to do was look at the back of the cards. Yep. And I remember in the late 80s, you'd get some of these guys who had played since the early 70s, and the back of the cards just all these stats.
Stacked. Yep.
And I'm like, what did that look like? That was me as a kid. I'm like, what did this look like over 162 games? Was it up and down? Was it consistent?
Right.
What did this look like? And so I was always into that. But then also, I was a pretty typical four-sport American. We had 4 sports in Philadelphia. So it was easy to follow all 4 major professional leagues. And yet, growing up as an Eagles fan, my favorite players were not Eagles. Growing up as a Sixers fan, my favorite player was Michael Jordan. So I guess I was made for fantasy anyway, but I loved Dan Marino and John Elway. But I especially loved Dan Marino because he was doing these things that, other than Warren Moon in that era, nobody was putting up numbers like that. And Warren Moon's a different discussion unto himself. And I think that was what ultimately kind of paved the way. But I will say this, in the late 90s, when I was sort of coming of age, becoming a person I ultimately was going to be, I remember hearing people playing fantasy. I'm like, nerds. You're doing what? That's so nerdy. And then only a couple of years later, I was super into it myself.
I feel like that's the path that a lot of people, whenever they initially hear about fantasy football, they're like, oh my gosh, this is so stupid. This is so dumb. And then you start to dig in and you just realize the connection that you build around the game of football itself. And it's not just about, whooping up on your teammates or your league mates rather, and, building these teams. It's also just having a deeper appreciation of the game itself. People always come up to me and they're like, oh, you're from Pittsburgh, you're a Steelers fan. And I'm still a fan, I guess. That's my team, if I'm supposed to pick a team and root for a team. But the feelings I have about that team are not nearly the same as they were, even 10 years ago, where I just have appreciation for 10 years ago, JJ would hate me, or 15 years ago, JJ would hate to hear me say that I like Lamar Jackson and I like the Ravens and John Harbaugh and what they've done there, right? But it's just, this is what fantasy football does. You just have this natural appreciation for other players. And to me, that's a really healthy relationship to have, with the sport and such. So it's good to hear you say that. Now, let's talk a little fantasy. Let's talk about some takes. Let's start more on the strategy game theory side. Right now this season, we're seeing wide receivers get drafted earlier than probably we've seen in the decade plus that we've been doing this stuff. And my question to you, obviously, with best ball, it leans in that direction just for a lot of strategy related reasons, but we're seeing more of these zero RB type teams in season long managed leagues too. My question just is, what do you think of that? Do you agree with it? Do you think that that's the way it should have always been, or have people just gone mad and they've just gone way too wide receiver heavy?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, don't make the mistake, if you're listening to this, of comparing what you're doing in best ball with what's going to happen in your home leagues.
Yeah.
It's not a fair comparison because it's a different game, especially if you're in BB Mania or something like that, where you're playing a tournament where you're trying to beat thousands upon thousands upon thousands of lineups, and you don't have to make start-sit decisions, and you don't have to make waiver decisions, and you don't have to worry about trading. So it's just a different game. But to answer your other question, I don't know if it should always have been this way, because if we compare the league to what it was 20 years ago, Sean Alexander doesn't exist in today's NFL.
Right.
You know, like our top, McCaffrey was 339 touches last year, right? 339 touches. What would that have finished, like 10th 20 years ago in the league? It's just a different game. But in the last, say, decade to decade and a half, as this evolution has taken place from a more run-centric to a more pass-centric league, I actually think this is the right way. And I'll tell you where it happened for me. I always say that I'm never going to go out and tell anybody how to play fantasy football. I'm just going to tell you how I play fantasy football. And you can disagree with me all you want. Just realize why you disagree with me. Don't just disagree with me because you don't like me. I mean, find a reason why, a rational reason why, and then apply that to your own strategy. And you're going to get better in the process. But I play this way because for the longest time in one of my home leagues, in fact, the first league that I was ever in, it's still ongoing. That's my draft on Saturday is in that league. I have everything, my entire career, to thank that league for, so it gives me chills even just thinking about it. But there was a long running joke that I could not win that league. So I would make the playoffs every year, and then I would just fizzle out every single year. It even was to the point I was married in 2011, and the best man speech, but best man is also in that league. And that was part of the best man speech was how I could not win that league. And everybody laughed. It was a great time. Well, I did win in 2011, thankfully. And it was the first time I had won that league. It was like 15 years into the league and I finally win it. But I realized what I was doing wrong is I was doing the traditional approach of running backs early and often. I was convincing myself that there was depth at wide receiver. And then I would get into the playoffs and one or more of my running backs would be hurt because we have that volatility. You touch the ball more often, you're more likely to get hurt. I was investing my most valuable picks in those guys. And even if you handcuff, all right. And then I would run into teams with more firepower at wide receiver and I would just get blown out. I'd finish third, I'd make the championship and lose and so on. And so two things that I made mistakes on. I invested too many of my valuable picks at running back as opposed to maybe 1 or 0. I don't mind a hero RB approach if the board is right.
Right.
But then also, yes, there's a lot of depth at wide receiver, but JJ, there is not a lot of depth at elite wide receiver.
Exactly. Yes.
And that's where I didn't have the firepower. So I do think it is right, but it may not be right for everybody if you can't handle swings. Because it is a little bit more volatile, week over week, but long-term, your ceiling is very high. I just know there are fantasy managers out there who can't take those swings and as a result start playing emotionally. And when you play emotionally, you're going to make bad decisions. I've just told you, I'm kind of real zen about all this stuff. Like when I watch football, I'm kind of quiet. I don't really go high or low when it comes to fantasy decisions either, but that doesn't always fit everybody else's perspective. For me, it works really well though.
Yeah, I think the point about there being few elite wide receivers is a really good one. Because, if you look at the landscape right now, you get, 7 or 8, really elite guys you feel good about that you'll draft in the first round, you won't think twice. And then you get into round 2, and it just starts to get so flat, right? Where you're like, okay, what's the real difference between Drake London and Marvin Harrison versus Jalen Waddle and, even into, if you want to, the DJ Moore range, let's say, for some people, or that caliber of player, right? But your point of there being few elite players and few elite wide receivers, you can make the argument that the position is really, really deep, but how many of these guys are actually going to be those difference-making type players? It's becoming similar to what we've seen with running back with these split backfields, where the reason that we feel so good about CMC, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall is because they're unicorns. We just don't have, they're literally the 3 guys that we can project. There's going to probably be another guy that steps up, hopefully this season, that maybe gets to that range in terms of volume that we're, maybe it's an Isaiah Pacheco, or maybe Kyron Williams does see the workload that people, that he saw last year, whatever. We might, or maybe it's Travis Etienne. We might see one of these guys step up and be that true bell cow, sure. But from a projectable volume standpoint, it's those are the guys. Those are the elite guys that we can confidently draft. It feels similar with these wide receivers where it might feel kind of deep, because to me, running back actually feels kind of deep from the standpoint of getting a Chase Brown, Tajay Spears, in these split backfields later, or a, just whoever, name your middle round running back, like those kinds of players didn't necessarily exist back when we were talking about, because a lot of those backfields ended up being just bell cow backfields, right? And so we're in this really weird place where somehow JJ Zachariason is way more okay with drafting quarterbacks earlier, right? Because there is this like drop with these elite wide receivers and elite running backs to where you just feel a little bit more, you're like, okay, what else am I going to spend this on? Or elite tight ends, right? What else am I going to spend this on? But along those lines, do you think there is any validity to going with a running back approach? This has been one of the top questions that I've been asked all offseason. Going running back, maybe you are in the front half of the draft and you're able to get one of those big three. Would you be okay with going running back then in the second round? Or are you afraid that you're just going to fall behind at wide receiver, or you're going to at least lose your opportunity of throwing the right darts at those potential elite wide receivers?
For me, I look at drafts in terms of making up ground on opponents, and I feel like it is really difficult to make up ground on your opponent at wide receiver. The easiest position I still think is quarterback. You still can get away with those late round approaches that you are so closely associated with. Running back, I can make up ground. So for me, I would not be looking to go running back. I know in that, when you get out of the running back dead zone period, there are those guys, you just mentioned a couple of them, who they offer some bang for the buck. And they're also one backfield mate injury away from an even larger workload, because, in both of those backfields, you talk about whether it's Cincinnati, whether it's Tennessee, the number 3/number 4, I'm not really convinced. Like Travion Williams, shout out Travion Williams. He's been in the NFL for seemingly 25 years at this point. But now Chris Evans out for the season. That sucks. It's weird with Haskins and Chestnut in the Tennessee backfield. So all of a sudden, whether it's Spears or Chase Brown, I mean, with the juice that those guys offer too, a lot of ROI potential. So, but I want to go back to something I said earlier. That's what works for me. If you're listening to this right now and you're like, no, I'm totally comfortable if I got Bijan at pick 4 and then I come back around and whoever's there, whatever running back you're looking at, Kyron or whoever, cool. If that works for you, then do it. I just know that I've fallen behind with that approach far too many times. And like you said, I don't want to feel light at the top end of my wide receiver group. I really want that group to have some firepower to it.
Yeah, and you want to be able to, again, like throw darts at the potential. Like, we say that it gets flatter, but a guy like Nico Collins has a much greater probability of being an alpha or being a wide receiver 1 or ascending. And I'm not to say that I'm like high or low on Nico Collins, but he has a better opportunity or chance to do that than Zay Flowers or even like a Pickens or something like that. Like these guys that then go in round 4 into round 5 and so on, where those are the guys that you would be having to rely on if you don't go wide receiver early. So there is that opportunity cost aspect. There is one running back, though. I was looking at your rankings very quickly, in preparation. I wanted to ask you just some stuff about, some of these specific players. In the second round, a lot of people are okay, and I'm part of it actually, okay with drafting Devon Achane. And with late round perspectives, I always want I'm trying to find sort of counter arguments and other perspectives on these particular players. Achane, I think we probably would agree on most of the argument for and against Achane. It's just a matter of like where you would particularly land on him. But I'm curious about your thoughts on him, because he, to me, is probably a top 5 most polarizing player in fantasy football this year.
Yeah, I mean, I have him as a mid 3rd round grade. RB is at RB 15 right now, which is a little bit lower. The highest I've seen him is maybe 7 or 8 in people's rankings. There's a couple things. I mean, first and foremost, when you look at the size profile, does he profile as anything more than an 8 to 12 touch a game type of player? I would love to say he's 10 to 15, and I'd love to be proven wrong on that by Mike McDaniel with his awesome new look, by the way.
It looks great. Yeah.
It's pretty epic. I mean, Miami Mike, I'm here for that. But that's the concern. He being Mike McDaniel has noted in the offseason that the backfield is still led by Raheem Mostert. And I realize he's up there in age a little bit, but he's still going to be used. And then they also drafted Jalen Wright, who I think he's probably closer to Mostert than he is to Achane. I know a lot of people are looking at him as an Achane, but Mostert's not the biggest guy either. And they're all fast. But I'm not convinced there's enough touches there. And I'm also not convinced that you can keep up historically insane levels of efficiency. I still love him, but when I'm looking at one of those running backs, especially a top 12 guy, I even struggle with this with Jahmyr Gibbs a little bit, but there's more volume at least there for him. Is there competition in that backfield for touches? And then what does the competition look like? And then where are you getting the ball? Like James Cook is another one. Where are you getting the ball? Are you getting the ball down at the goal line? Well, he didn't last year. It was Josh Allen and Latavius Murray. And this year they drafted a 5'8", 220-pound bowling ball in Ray Davis, who probably could get that work as well as Josh Allen. So that's part of the equation. I do love him, but I feel like if I'm drafting a running back as a top 12 running back on my board, not top 12 overall pick, but top 12 running back, I want a few less items in the con category and a few more in the pro category.
Yeah, I think it's fair. Like to me, he just has a super wide range of outcomes. Like would you agree that if things hit the right way and break the right way, you can then see the ceiling for a guy like Achane?
If things break the right way, like ultimate right way, then he's like CJ2K in his prime. I mean,
exactly.
He could be that type of player.
Right.
But I also, I am aware, and I think this gets lost in a lot of drafters, like rankings and all of that are midpoints. Projections are midpoints. They're, and they don't have to be the precise midpoint. There's a nuance to rankings. You can move players around, but it's really foolish to rank or project a player at their absolute ceiling.
Sure.
His absolute ceiling is enormous. We've seen it. Like, it's freakish. Like, this is a guy who he could potentially put an entire week of fantasy production up on 3 touches, and that doesn't even have to be 3 catches. It could be 3 carries with this dude. That's how impressive he is. But I'm a regression type of person, and I think that is a very viable concern with him. He's still top 15 though, and he's right there. I have him right behind Joe Mixon, Kenneth Walker, those guys in that range who probably figure to touch the ball a lot more than he does.
Yeah, it's fair. And you mentioned Gibbs too. I think that Achane is a pretty good arbitrage on Gibbs if you're thinking about it like from an archetype standpoint. Like, I think Gibbs is drafted where he probably should be. Like, I'm not going to hate on anyone for drafting him where he gets drafted because obviously the efficiency side is there. And I do think that, given everything that we talked about, and maybe you would disagree, but if you want to chime in, but given everything that we talked about like there being true bell cow backs and very few of them in the NFL, that means that there's more running backs who aren't hitting high volume ceilings. And so what do we have to lean back on? Well, we have to lean back on efficiency a little bit more, right? Now, can we project efficiency as well as people think? Probably not, right? Like you've dealt with this for years and years doing projections and such, and knowing that a lot of these efficiency metrics just end up regressing, and that's the number one thing that we really should be paying attention to. But at the same time, I think that there are some archetypes in general, like a Gibbs, like an Achane, to a lesser degree, James Cook, and then, even to a lesser degree than that, like what we saw last year out of like Keaton Mitchell, right before he got banged up and hurt his knee. And so as a result of that, I think that we are kind of in this newish era of football where efficiency will matter more in the individual season. It might just come down to how well we are at, or how good we are at actually projecting that efficiency.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. And that is going to be the ultimate challenge, especially when it comes to scoring touchdowns. We know how challenging that is. I tend to take the same approach, the same mindset as our friend Mike Clay, that, I'm not trying to every year reinvent the wheel or improve in leaps and bounds. Like he always says, I want to get like 1% better, And when it comes to projections, it may not sound like a lot, but that actually is pretty sizable.
Oh, that's
and if
significant.
You year over year, it really becomes a great measuring stick for how effective we can be.
Yeah. Now, speaking on taking on some risk in the early rounds, Marvin Harrison Jr., we have not seen a rookie wide receiver. I mean, you could lump Malik Neighbors in here to some degree too, because he's been rising over the last month and a half up draft boards as well. But we've never seen a rookie wide receiver get drafted this high. He's a top 12 wide receiver. He's being drafted as a top 12 wide receiver. Are people nuts? Because I've seen analysts say people are absolutely nuts for going in this direction. I've also seen others say, no, he's elite. This is where he should be going. Where do you land with that Marvin Harrison Jr. discussion?
He's an impressive talent. There's no doubt about that. But, Malik Neighbors was right there with him. And there were a lot of actual very smart draft analysts who had Malik Neighbors a tick ahead of him. Now, his quarterback situation is obviously superior. Daniel Jones, that preseason appearance was not good.
Yeah.
Really, really bad. I don't know what they're going to do there. But the nice thing is, we've seen talented wide receivers put up decent numbers in bad situations. So I'm not worried about Neighbors, but I know he's definitely going before I'm willing to take him. And I think that Marvin Harrison Jr. does as well. I actually do have him at 12, but that's sort of a really clustered, like I could rank any of these guys at, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and any order, any day, because they're all basically largely the same. The challenge that I think a lot of fantasy drafters are going to run into, and this is something that happened with Kyle Pitts, even in his rookie season, but especially after that point. But his rookie season, Kyle Pitts goes out, he has a 1,000-yard season for a tight end, which is unheard of. Like Ditka, and that was it. That was the list. Now we have 2 on that list, and yet he only had, he was the 2 touchdowns that year. So he didn't find the end zone, and so therefore he was a disappointment. People drafted him at tight end 4 or tight end 5, and he finished at tight end 6. So he's a massive disappointment because of that. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but that was the general sentiment.
Right.
If you draft a player at his ceiling, there's usually only one outcome for you as a casual or even more intermediate level fantasy player. It's disappointment. You're going to be disappointed because you expected ceiling and you probably got closer to midpoint. So if you're stepping up to draft Marvin Harrison Jr. as a top 10 wide receiver, be aware of that. Yes, it's a interesting situation. Kyler, I think, is a good skill set match for Kyler. There's very little competition for targets among the wide receivers. Michael Wilson, and then a whole lot of nothing. Yes, McBride is there. James Conner will catch the ball out of the backfield a little bit, but it's a good spot. However, that would be my biggest fear, is drafting him at his ceiling and then expecting ceiling level production.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's definitely, just in general, like I think that we have to recognize too, just as like a fantasy community, that when you're drafting players in the first round and a half of a draft, there's only going to be a handful of players that actually like exceed. And I say handful, I mean like 4 guys that like truly exceed that expectation of what we what we're expecting these guys to do based on that draft capital. Like we're all we feel very confident about, the big 6 or 7 wide receivers or however many there are. Like we feel good about Amon-Ra St. Brown and Justin Jefferson, but number one, some of these guys are probably going to underperform. And then you get to the latter parts of the first round and you get into a little bit more ambiguity. We can love Garrett Wilson. There's obvious reasons to like Garrett Wilson. But again, meeting expectation is not very easy, in those early rounds. And I do think you hit the nail on the head with Marvin Harrison Jr. And it goes back to what we were talking about before. When you get into the second round, things just get flat. Like it's just a very flat range. And it just goes to show that the front half of your draft, usually this is the case. I mean, getting the 101, people always ask what draft slot is best. It's usually just get the first pick in the draft or get an early pick in the draft, right? Instead of getting at the tail end. This year, it's just so glaringly obvious that the front half of your draft is better than the back half, because the front half, you end up getting one of those studs. And then the second round comes around. Everyone's the same in the second round. And then there's another drop off as you get to the end of the third round, so you can get screwed again if you're in that back part of the first round. So I think that's kind of why, because I have Marvin Harrison ranked pretty similar. I actually now have him below. I like Jalen Waddle a lot this year, so I have Waddle ahead of him. And I actually like Chris Olave with the offensive coordinator change and stuff there. And so I think that you can make the argument for him over Harrison and stuff. And I'm not going to fault anyone if they want to throw like a Nico over him or a Devontae Adams over whoever. Like there's just so many of those guys. But I still have Marvin Harrison, ranked in that like top 12-ish range. But a lot of that just has to do with the alternatives there. Like what else is there to really throw ahead of him? But I will say that if you look at like historical rookie production and you look at how they perform versus ADP expectation over the last decade, it's been pretty good. We just haven't seen a wide receiver, because obviously expectation rises if you're going in the early second round. But guys like Jamar Chase when they were rookies, and Amari Cooper is another one who was drafted relatively early whenever he was a rookie. Those guys dominant. Like they had a really good rookie season to be able to beat expectations. So I think that's sort of the look for Harrison. Were you one of those people who had Malik Neighbors above Marvin Harrison as prospects, or were you Harrison over Neighbors?
No, it was Harrison over Neighbors. Fortunately, last year I followed college football more than I ever had in the past because I actually had to cover college football. And that was a short segment for that other pregame show that I'm on throughout the season on CBS Sports Network. But it was like I had to know what was going on, and I get to watch them very closely. They're both very good, and so is Roma Dute for that matter. Very good. The landscape is changing. Part of this is because running backs aren't getting paid what they used to, and especially when you look at the overall salaries in comparison to some of these other positions, like top running backs getting $12 million a year, top wide receivers getting $30+ million a year. It's not even fair. And so, I actually talked to Mark Ingram when I was at the Super Bowl on Radio Row, had him on my radio show. And I asked him flat out, like, do you think this is going to change at the youth level? And he said, I do. He said, back when I was young, you were the best kid on the team. You either played running back or quarterback, right?
Yeah.
And he said now a lot of those kids are now playing wide receiver, corner, like things like that, playing both ways maybe. And now you also have kids coming into the college level with polished route trees. That. Remember the third year wide receiver? We just don't see that anymore because there's so much more polish coming into this. And like all three of those guys that I just mentioned are uber polished already. It's going to change things for sure, but this will also be make or break. Like if Marvin Harrison Jr. does not meet expectations, we know the pendulum always swings way further than it should. Like remember 2016, the year of zero RB, and Allen Robinson gets hurt in the very first game. DeAndre Hopkins has a down season. Overall passing was down across the league, and the reaction was back to RB centric in 2017.
Yep.
That could happen with rookie wide receivers. Who knows? I mean, we'll see.
Yeah, it's a good point. Because, look, like I said, rookies historically have been very, very good against ADP in redraft, but we haven't seen ADP quite like this. We have at times with running backs, obviously didn't work out as well for like Bijan and like CEH, but it did for Zeke and Jahmyr Gibbs, who had relatively high, Saquon, like Najee Harris. Like it's worked out for a lot of those guys too. It's just this is the first time that we're really entering this landscape with wide receivers. And by the way, you mentioned Mark Ingram. If you ever talk to him again, tell him to unblock me on Twitter. I once, look, it was my fault. It was 100% my fault. It was when he got suspended for steroid use and he returned to action. And I sent a snarky tweet because he had a really, really good game, the first game back after his suspension. And I sent a tweet out that said something along the lines of Mark Ingram's running like he just came out, just got done using steroids. So it was a necessary block. I deserved it. I deserved that Dikembe Mutombo for that one for sure. So all right, so we talked about this a little bit with the backfields with like Tennessee and and Cincinnati. I want to ask you about Pittsburgh as well, because I'm always advocating, and this is just based on my research and stuff, what I call people to target in the middle rounds, what I call ambiguous backfields. So backfields where you get multiple middle round running backs from the same backfield. People want to avoid them because of the uncertainty. But really, those are the kinds of the kind of backfields that you want to go after because of the uncertainty. That's why their prices are lower than otherwise would be. So we have three that I think are the most intriguing from an ambiguity standpoint. You have Tennessee, Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati. I want to ask you, out of those three backfields at cost, so you have different ADPs for these guys. They're not really drastically different, I'd say, from like one player to the next. So this really could just be who do you like more, period, out of these backfields. But give me the player from these backfields that you would prefer. And maybe some of these backfields you're like, I'm just throwing darts evenly across my drafts.
I think Tennessee is the evenly, if I was to say, of those. And that's based on my best ball portfolio. It's kind of been whoever's there, I'll take, and I just want one of them. I don't want both of them. I don't want to do that. What's the argument that people say? I want to lock up all the points in the background. No, you just created yourself a weekly conundrum.
It's a floor, not a ceiling play.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't mind either. I mean, Tony Pollard, the volume was great last year. It's just he was exceedingly inefficient at the goal line. Spears is explosive. So, I mean, maybe he gives you a little bit more of a ceiling, maybe a tiny higher floor for Pollard, but we could see a legit 50-50, like no change. Like they're playing the same role. They're just rotating in the role. So that's the one drawback there. Pittsburgh, I originally was thinking Warren, but, and it's not really the hamstring as much. Like I don't think Najee Harris gets the appreciation that he deserves.
I kind of agree with you. Yeah, I kind of agree with you.
If you did that thing that people do on Twitter where they're like, here's player X and here's his stats, like nobody would be able to guess that it was Najee Harris. He has not missed a single game in his career. He's topped 1,000 yards each of those seasons, double-digit touchdowns, total touchdowns first 2 years, 8 last year. He catches the ball out of the backfield. Sure, he's a plotter. Sure, he's not explosive, but the world needs RB2s as well. Like they can't all just be elite running backs. And Najee Harris kind of checks that box for me. Now, of course, it's the Artie party in Pittsburgh with Arthur Smith, so you do have to at least deal with that. As far as Cincinnati, like I'm with you on this one. It's Chase Brown, and it's not really close for me at this point. I do have Zach Moss best ball shares because you have to if you're playing in enough best ball leagues. But Chase Brown gives you that explosive upside. I mean, he is a screen pass dynamo. I mean, get the ball in his hands and let things happen. And in the process, like I'd always had this perception because when you don't see these guys in person, some guys maybe play a little smaller or a little bigger than what they really are. I thought he was smaller than he actually is. Like he's not a small, he's not 185 pounds out there. So he actually, and he handled a big workload at the college level. So he could potentially take that backfield and run with it. The other thing too, and I know you've dabbled in some next gen stats a little bit. Zach Moss was one of, if you looked at speed last year, he was one of the slowest backs in the league. And it was like the list was at the bottom of the list was like Zach Moss, Kareem Hunt, who was on his last leg.
Like literally.
Yeah. And like, do I really want that? Like, sure, you can have some plunges for touchdowns, but I don't want to play the Mike Allstott game here. I would rather have that explosive upside in an explosive offense. So Chase Brown there.
Yeah, I like those picks a lot. The Najee thing, for whatever reason, he's been one of my highest rostered Best Ball Mania backs, and I'm like 135 in, so I'm almost maxed out in Best Ball Mania. And a lot of the logic there is I just think that Najee might be one of those guys that coaching staffs like more than a fantasy analyst does when we're looking at some of these efficiency metrics. But not only that, he really wasn't that bad. I think that I faded him I wasn't as into him last year at cost just because he was going in like the third round. Now he's not going in the third round. And so, last year, I was part of the, well, what if Jalen Warren is like they want to split the backfield up more than we think, yada, 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 which sure, like good, relatively proper take. But I won't lie, Najee Harris's numbers, especially like down the stretch last year, he was a lot more efficient than I think people realize. Like he wasn't nearly as bad of a actual running back than folks realize. And now you get Arthur Smith coming in. It wouldn't shock me if, sure, it could end up being a 50-50 situation. That's why ADPs look the way that they do. But it also wouldn't shock me if they just slightly favor Najee a little bit, and that's enough for him to beat ADP. And then you have the upside of, okay, Jalen Warren's already hurt, obviously, but if he does get hurt more long-term, it doesn't seem like it's long-term, then Najee's ceiling will definitely hit. I like the take with Tennessee. I've been getting both of them. I always just say I'm going for Spears because he's been cheaper for the most part, but I think Pollard, like you said, Tony Pollard last year, from like an expected fantasy point standpoint, was totally fine. He just couldn't find the end zone. He couldn't convert at the goal line. That's been really, really frustrating. And then the Chase Brown stuff, man, like he carried a huge workload in college, like you said, a little bit bigger. He's like 209-ish, a little bit bigger than people realize. He's not that much smaller. There's not that big of a size difference between him and like a Zach Moss. I think it's just that, maybe it's just like the way that we view things with the explosion and the explosiveness is that when you see that kind of speed, you automatically think less weight, and you attribute less weight to that player. But yeah, I mean, do you think it's a reasonable thing to think in terms of range of outcomes that Chase Brown could end up being a bell cow in Cincinnati this year?
I mean, it's within the range of outcomes for sure. It's, how do we define bell cow? Are you talking like 16 plus touches per game? That might be tough. Yeah, but then again, if Zach Moss is a plotter out there, then, strange things happen. Last year coming in, everybody said, oh, it's going to be Dameon Pierce. And it was Devin Singletary, the guy who we didn't see coming. I think a lot more of a see the Chase Brown thing coming. And the beautiful aspect here, and this is why I love avoiding the dead zone and then really attacking after we get out of the dead zone, is if you hit on even one of these guys, the ROI on that is massive for your team, and you're way ahead of your opponents in the process. So you kept pace with them at wide receiver, or maybe even outpaced them at wide receiver, and then boom, you just caught up to them, hopefully laughed them at running back as well when you hit on guys like that. And that's what I'm looking for. Massive ceilings. He does offer that.
Right. The running backs that are going to go a round or two ahead of him just aren't going to give you, in terms of even projectable output. Like yes, their projectable output looks better, but the delta, like the actual difference in that output is just not significant enough and not like league winning enough for you to say, oh, I got to get this guy who has his backfield to himself versus this other guy who's more in this ambiguous situation who can at least give us maybe some flex low-end RB2 production without an injury, but with an injury or just talent emerging. It's rocket ship emojis. All right, so let's talk about the quarterback position. Obviously, something that I've written about a lot in my history, and I feel like every time I go on podcasts now, they're like, "You got to talk about quarterbacks, man, because you're the late round quarterback guy." And I'm like, okay, this is like it's a little bit of a different landscape these days. But speaking of that landscape, how are you approaching that position this year? And do you agree with me that the market at quarterback seems incredibly efficient, especially versus what it was 5, 6, 7 years ago?
I do agree there. The common man, the water cooler drafters out there have caught on. Used to be they drafted quarterbacks early and often because they scored the most points, and they kind of neglected to understand value of a replacement and all of that. So yeah, it has caught up, but there still are a lot of folks who feel that need to draft the quarterback early, or they do this thing that they feel the need to fill their starting spots and then draft their bench. And I always say, hey, if you're drafting bench players, you're not drafting starters. They're players who should be on your bench. So maybe pivot away from that and start thinking about it as a complete roster, or like a holistic view to your roster. But yeah, much more so. I still think that there are spots to find value at quarterback. And the way that I've been approaching it is kind of seeing if there's any chance one of the elite guys falls, and I say 3 rounds, which doesn't happen in home leagues, but it occasionally happens in industry leagues, then I'm going to pounce on one of those top 4. Otherwise, I find the best value is usually round 10. Weirdly enough, top 12 guys in one quarterback leagues fall to round 10. Yeah. They do. You will occasionally see Brock Purdy. I had a subscriber at ftnfantasy.com who said he got Kyler Murray there. I was like, dude, that's stealing.
That is, yes. Yeah,
like, that's great. Like, they leave him there, then take him. If not, then yeah, I'm totally happy to go with a late round approach. But if I can grab Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, hell, if you're going to give me Kyler Murray there, I'm not getting Richardson. We know that. He's not going to make it. I'm not getting Stroud. Dak Prescott. I don't know why people have this aversion. They're like allergic to Dak in some fantasy leagues. Guy had 36 passing touchdowns last year, and he could be playing for the most lucrative free agency contract in NFL history if they don't figure something out. And it doesn't sound very good right now there. Yeah. So I would love to do that. Those are the guys. I don't think Burrow gets there, but those are usually the guys who might be available in round 10.
Yeah, I think in most normal leagues, you're going to find that a low-end QB1 will just naturally fall because people aren't going to be taking backup quarterbacks before they're filling out some bench spots on their roster and stuff. And so naturally, you might be able to take advantage because there's a pretty decent tier, of those players. Are you drafting the rookie duo, the Jaden Daniels, Caleb Williams duo?
Well, I was drafting Jaden Daniels until he went up boards. Like, if he's going in round 9, then no. Caleb still hangs around a little bit longer, and I'd be totally fine with him if the other guys dried up. Purdy, Love, all those guys at the back end of the QB1s. Totally fine with Caleb Williams. And this isn't a reaction to the preseason. I watched him all the way through college. This is a kid who came in at Oklahoma, had a Heisman candidate, a possible first overall pick ahead of him, and he said, screw that, I'm taking the job from this dude. And obviously Spencer Rattler has turned out to what Spencer Rattler is, but it not phased. I loved in Hard Knocks this week where he's like, the only time I ever got nervous was my first game in high school. He's like,
that blew me away just hearing that, because I believed him too. Whenever he said that, it's crazy.
100%. He has the ability to play both inside and outside of structure. He can make throws that, a lot of these guys can make in practice. He can make it in a game. He has the ability to move. He's not Jaden Daniels from a speed standpoint. He's more Mahomesian in that he will take what the defense gives him, but also that scramble. He did show some athletic chops to scramble out of trouble and then ultimately turn it into 6 points for his offense. So I like him a lot. If I was going to get any other guy like for, the ability to exceed expectation with a ceiling in this range, like Trevor Lawrence and Justin Herbert, they're going in the late round. And I mean, rightfully so. But remember, last year, you weren't even sniffing either one of these guys in this range. They still have that ceiling. Yes, it's a different situation a lot for Herbert. It's not for Trevor Lawrence. In fact, he has maybe better weapons downfield for more of a, the upside. So I don't mind those guys. And I mean, you can get Tua for free back here as well. Like there are still options if you don't get that value in the 10th, 9th, 10th round, like I mentioned.
Yeah, no, I think those are good call outs because we're going to see one of those guys probably have sort of an outlier touchdown rate type season because we do every single year with these pocket passers. Now, are we going to be able to pinpoint exactly who that dude is? Not necessarily, but I think that you can at least increase your probability a little bit. Like you said, like Trevor Lawrence is someone that I've gone to a lot, and like best ball especially. Not only is he easily stackable, but like you said, it's like they add Gabe Davis, who at least can play the role that he plays, and then Brian Thomas, who I liked a lot as a prospect and already is showing up. You have Christian Kirk, who can play both inside out, probably will play inside in 3 wide sets. I mean, it's a good offensive situation, and we know the talent hypothetically would be there for Lawrence. I like that call out a lot. Speaking of Jacksonville, just as an offense in general, if you're able to pinpoint offenses at a high level instead of just digging into the individual players, you can win fantasy football just by doing that, by understanding which offenses in general are going to exceed expectation, because everyone in an offense will then be able to exceed expectation. Do you have any sort of lower key offenses that you think are flying under the radar right now that might be able to surprise people this year?
Yeah, there are some every single year. I mean, you do have to dig in the crates a little bit for sure. You can't just say Atlanta because everybody's going to say Atlanta, right? I think a couple that would stand out to me, like we talked about the Tennessee backfield, like if Will Levis does take a step forward, and let's read between the lines. That's why Brian Callahan was hired.
Exactly.
If he can take a step forward with his ability to push the ball vertically. Now, granted, that was to a fault last year. Like the age-old misnomer is that young quarterbacks check down. No, they don't. They throw vertically, and that's a problem in the NFL with these athletic safeties back there. But you do have a downfield dynamo in Calvin Ridley, and DeAndre Hopkins was coming off a rare downfield target year for him too. So there's a lot of juice there. I think those guys could potentially exceed expectations, even though they're not, we've never heard of these guys. They're household names, but they're still much better values. Like Calvin Ridley's way better valued than last year. Denver, I really think Bo Nix is a solid quarterback. He can move the offense. So Cortland Sutton, you're getting at dirt cheap value. If Javonte Williams can actually get back to pre-injury form now that he's a full year removed, returns some value there. And then the squad that I think is probably the most intriguing, but by far the most question marks, is Carolina. Dave Canales was able to revitalize Geno Smith's career. He was able to revitalize, and granted, give credit to Geno, give credit to Baker Mayfield, but he did the same thing for Baker Mayfield. Can he now do so for Bryce Young only in year 2? They may not have Xavier Legette out there in the beginning of the season because he missed so much time in camp. It might be Mingo early, but you don't draft a dude at the end of the first round at wide receiver to keep him as your number 4 receiver. If Deontay Johnson can stay healthy, he should exceed expectation. And then Jonathan Brooks depends on when he gets on the field, but he's a superior player to Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders. Yeah. So I think that's a team. It's going to take a little bit of time to gel, but let's not forget, like last year, 5 weeks into the season, people are cutting Jordan Love left and right, and then he goes on down the stretch to play at an MVP caliber. He was doing things that really we had only seen out of MVP quarterbacks in the past. So it does take some time for some of these offenses to gel, but those would be some of the deeper ones that I'm not afraid to get exposure to because the cost is so cheap right now.
Yeah, I love those calls. I love the Tennessee one in particular. You mentioned the Will Levis stuff, throwing it downfield. He threw it downfield 20 plus yards at like 8 percentage points higher than any other quarterback last year. It was just absolutely wild. But here's the thing, like with Will Levis, you get better weapons around him. You get a pass heavier offense too around him with Brian Callahan stepping in. They're going to run a lot more 11 personnel. Like, could we see just like a DGAF Jameis Winston type year out of Will Levis? And Yes, I think we could. And if we do, that's fantasy football heaven. Like that's what we would like. We don't care about the interceptions as much, right? Like they're not that big of a deal, even from a quarterback scoring standpoint. But if you're going to see that volume and see that volume down the field, I'm with you, man. I have a ton of Calvin Ridley. Unfortunately, I have a ton of DeAndre Hopkins. I only say that unfortunately because obviously his ADP fell, after the injury. But I don't want to say all in on the Tennessee offense, but I think that's at least my 1A offense that could end up surprising this season because there's just a lot of pieces to be bullish about. And it's not like I always like when we get this like regime change and like you might see a complete, a black and just a flip of what we saw with Vrabel and going to a completely different philosophy with Brian Callahan. The offensive line is somewhat of a question mark, but they got Callahan to coach the offensive line too, which I think could be a really, really big boom. So I'm with you. I like that call out a ton. All right, before I let you go, Jeff, give me 2 of your favorite double-digit round picks for fantasy football this season.
I love drafting for ceiling at wide receiver in this range. So the first one is going to be A.D. Mitchell, and also another player who may not necessarily be a clear starter at the beginning of the season, but he is a speedster, can play downfield, and it's always alarming if you have a player who does something and then the team drafts kind of the exact same player.
Yeah.
So Alec Pierce, even if he is having a nice camp, the writing was on the wall there. Now, they'll probably both be on the field as long as Josh Downs is out, but once he's back, I mean, this is like a late season play with that big arm of Anthony Richardson. I love the fit there. And then the other one, all right, well, let's react to the news of the day. I think Luke McCaffrey is kind of interesting now all of a sudden.
Yeah,
I didn't initially, but hey, like a week ago, we heard Dan Quinn saying they're searching for their number 2 receiver, and everybody's like, well, Jahan Dotson, I guess that isn't a thing. And now obviously it isn't. It opens the door. There's, De'Ami Brown is there, Olamide Zaccheaus. Those guys aren't going to move the needle as much as a guy with the last name McCaffrey, who isn't quite his brother, no, but he can be an effective slot receiver. He has a little bit of juice to him as well. He can run after catch, and he's now seemingly going to get an opportunity to contribute in that offense. So why not throw a dart at him in the late rounds?
Yeah, I think that's a great call. And for the record, we're recording this on Thursday before, there's been rumors flying around about like Brandon Ayuk going there and them opening things up. So just to be clear, we have no idea what they're doing aside from the fact that they traded Jahan Dotson to the Eagles. That's all we know. And seemingly, look, bottom line is anytime a team makes a trade like that, I think that 99% chance that they did that because he was a potential cut candidate and they didn't want to fully, not that they would just full on cut him, but they wanted to get something for him because they didn't like what they saw out of him. To your point, they were talking about that through the media just last week. The thing though with McCaffrey is too often fantasy managers just think in terms of wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 with these teams. With every wide receiver is playing a different position, right? And when it comes to McCaffrey, like you said, he's a slot guy, and that's huge because they were lining up Dotson in the slot to get some slot work. He's played on the perimeter throughout his brief career so far, but they were lining him up in the slot with De'Ami Brown on the perimeter, right? And so if Jahan Dotson is gone, that is a quite literal replacement place for Luke McCaffrey to step in and see work there. And it's kind of been a position in the Cliff Kingsbury offense that's not been that bad in terms of being targeted at a pretty decent rate. So I'm with you, man. I think that's a very, very intriguing pick for sure. And interestingly enough, Adonai Mitchell, someone who played on the perimeter in college, is now getting some slot work with Josh Downs out. So that's good to see that he's not just stapled to that one place in that one position. And you mentioned him being sort of like an Alec Pierce, just straight up replacement. In my prospect model, Alec Pierce was one of Adonai Mitchell's top comps, statistical comps. So and they have a type.
Yeah, that's the alarm bells. Interestingly enough, by the way, Bo Nix, my comp for him was Russell Wilson. So there you go, Sean Payton. Real quick too, before we do get out of here, you made a great point there. Teams do not think of it this way. And I got attacked, imagine this, on Twitter.
Never.
At the NFL draft when I said Brock Bowers doesn't play the same position as Michael Mayer. And people were like, duh, they play tight end. But Michael Mayer is an inline tight end. He's a catch and fall down dude. Now he can catch quite well, and he can also fall down well. Brock Bowers is a dynamic weapon who is a move option who's probably best put in the slot or even out wide. They play different positions. Coaches look at it that way. When you watch them draw up on the board, they don't say wide receiver 1, 2, 3. They're X, Z, they're letters for these positions. And some guys can play across those positions, but a lot of them don't, and that's really important intel, and a great call out on Luke McCaffrey.
Yeah, I mean, look, and that's why like fantasy analysts who are digging into that stuff a little bit more than others, let's say, or just like, average and casual NFL fans, like we looked at like the Giants last year, for instance, and we're like, why do they have 8 slot receivers? Like why, like all they're doing, and then not only that, but then they draft Jalen Hyatt, who in college, in that really weird system that he played in, he lined up in the slot where he got the majority of his production. So it was like, this is kind of a weird fit too, when they clearly need a perimeter guy. Now, obviously they go out and they get Malik Neighbors, who can play anywhere, this season, but that's the kind of stuff that's more interesting, I think, and most important to us, is understanding the type of receiver that we're dealing with and how they sort of slot in. Because a lot of times you might see, a guy that looks like he could be the wide receiver 2 or quote unquote wide receiver 2, but maybe he's only a slot guy and they already have, a very, very good slot guy in that lineup. And so that player then is not going to find the field nearly as frequently, which is why this Dotson move, the biggest, obviously Terry McLaurin, probably a little bit of a winner, but to me, the biggest winner has to be Luke McCaffrey at the end of the day.
Yeah, I love that right there. And I think that the fantasy masses will adjust a little bit as we move into these final 2 weekends of drafts, but you're still going to be able to get them in the late rounds. So good call out.
100%. Jeff, man, this was an awesome back and forth. Love chatting it up. Let everyone know where they can find you and what you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So ftnfantasy.com is the website. If you want to use promo code RATPACK, you get 10% off. I have a radio show on Sirius XM at 9 to 11 a.m. Eastern, the very originally named Jeff Ratcliffe Show, Monday through Friday. I have a podcast called The Rant, and this season will be my 9th season on CBS Sports Network. Sunday mornings, 8 to noon Eastern. It's called That Other Pregame Show, or TOPS. It's a comprehensive look at football. It's not just a regular pregame show. We have all that stuff, but we also talk betting, fantasy, all of that, all on one show. It's the best show out there. And we're the first show, boots on the ground, at 8 a.m. on Sunday mornings. So Tune in.
I can't believe it's been 9 years already.
Neither can I.
Been doing that is wild. Time flies. You can find all my stuff, as usual, over on lateround.com. Check out the draft guide. Make sure you use that Underdog promo. You can get a free draft guide if you're not an Underdog user with promo code LateRound. Otherwise, everyone, good luck this weekend in your drafts. And as always, thanks for tuning in.